Everyone thought he was just an old fisherman until a hero rose from the waves. In a quiet coastal town in Maine, there was a shack by the docks, weathered by salt and time, where a man lived alone. His name was Jack. Just Jack. No last name, no stories, no past that anyone cared to ask about. Every morning, he'd mend his nets, push his rickety boat into the water, and drift out to sea. The townsfolk barely noticed him. But on one stormy night, when the ocean roared and a boat went missing, Jack showed them who he really was. And after that night, no one in Harbor Cove ever looked at him the same way again. Welcome to Silent Heroes. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know, where in the world are you watching this from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us keep these legends alive. Ready? Let's sail into Jack's story, a tale that's so much more than a fisherman's life. Harbor Cove, Maine, was a town built on the edge of the Atlantic, where the sea gave life and took it just as fast. Fishermen rose with the dawn, their boats bobbing in the gray light, their laughter mixing with the cries of gulls. At the far end of the docks stood a shack, its boards warped by decades of storms, its roof sagging under the weight of time. This was Jack's place. No one knew much about him, and no one asked. He was just the old guy in the faded flannel jacket, always wearing a worn-out baseball cap with no logo, his hands calloused from years of hauling nets. Jack showed up every morning at 5:30 sharp, like clockwork. He'd step out of his shack carrying a single fishing rod and a small cooler and head to his boat, a beat-up skiff that looked like it might sink in a stiff breeze. His face was lined with wrinkles, his eyes sharp but distant, like he was always looking past the horizon. The locals called him Old Jack, and the kids made up stories about him being a retired sailor, or maybe just a drifter who washed up one day and never left. At the local diner, the Harbor Light, fishermen swapped tales over coffee, but Jack was rarely mentioned. He's just a loner, they'd say. Catches enough fish to get by, drinks his coffee black, goes home. What else is there? The younger fishermen, like Tommy, a cocky 20-something with the fastest boat in town, didn't give Jack a second thought. That old skiff, Tommy would laugh, wiping grease from his hands. Man, Jack's lucky if he catches a minnow with that thing. The others would chuckle, and Jack, if he overheard, never reacted. He'd just nod, mend his nets, and keep to himself. That morning, the air felt heavy. The sky was a bruised gray, and the waves slapped hard against the docks. The local radio crackled with a storm warning. Gale force winds expected along the Maine coast. All vessels returned to port immediately. At the diner, fishermen huddled around their coffee mugs, debating whether to tie up their boats or risk one last run. Tommy, as usual, was all bravado. "This storm, it's nothing. I've seen worse," he said, grinning at his buddies. "We'll be back with a full haul before the rain even starts." Jack was at his shack, sitting on a crate, splicing a rope with steady hands. He glanced up as Tommy and his crew, 3 other young guys, headed for their boat. Jack's eyes flicked to the sky, then back to the sea. "Ocean's angry today, kid," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the wind. Tommy laughed, loud and sharp. "Relax, old man. Stick to your little skiff. We've got this." Jack didn't reply. He just watched as Tommy's boat, the Seahawk, roared out of the harbor, cutting through the rising waves. By noon, the storm had arrived. The wind howled, tearing shingles from roofs, and the waves grew into towering walls of water. Word spread fast. Tommy's boat hadn't come back. The radio crackled again. Coast Guard alerted. Fishing vessel Seahawk reported missing, last seen 5 miles offshore. At the docks, a crowd gathered, mothers, wives, kids, all staring at the churning sea, their faces tight with fear. Jack stood at the edge of his shack, watching the crowd. No one noticed him. Their eyes were glued to the horizon, praying for a miracle. But Jack's gaze was different, focused, steady, like a man who'd seen storms before and knew their secrets. He turned, stepped into his shack, and closed the door. Minutes passed. The crowd murmured, some shouting for the Coast Guard to hurry, others whispering that Tommy was gone for good. Then the shack's door creaked open. Jack stepped out, but this wasn't the Jack they knew. He wore an old wetsuit, faded but meticulously maintained, and carried a heavy canvas bag slung over his shoulder. His cap was gone, revealing gray hair cropped short, and his eyes burned with a purpose that made the crowd pause. "That's Jack?" someone whispered. Tommy's father, a grizzled fisherman named Hank, frowned. "What the hell's he doing?" Jack didn't answer. He moved to his skiff with a precision that silenced the murmurs. Every step was deliberate, every motion practiced. He untied the boat, checked the oars, and pushed off into the waves. The crowd gasped. "He's crazy," someone shouted. "That skiff won't last 10 minutes out there." But Jack's boat sliced through the water like it was born for the storm, steady and sure, as if the sea itself knew not to challenge him. The ocean was a beast. Waves crashed like thunder, and the wind screamed, tearing at anything in its path. The Coast Guard hadn't even left port. Their cutters couldn't navigate the swells. But Jack, in his tiny skiff, was a shadow moving through the chaos. The townsfolk watched, helpless, as his boat vanished into the spray. "He's gone," they whispered. "No one's coming back from that." Hours dragged on. The crowd thinned as hope faded, some heading home to escape the rain, others staying out of stubborn loyalty. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a faint light flickered on the water. It was Jack's skiff, and tethered to it, battered but afloat, was the Seahawk. The crowd surged forward, shouting, crying, pointing. Jack stood tall in his skiff, one hand on the oar, the other gripping a tow line. Tommy and his crew, soaked and shivering, clung to their boat, alive. Jack pulled them to the dock, tied off the line, and stepped onto the pier without a word. Tommy stumbled out, his bravado gone, and threw his arms around Jack. How did you find us? That storm, that boat." Jack just patted his shoulder. "The sea talks, kid. You just gotta listen." The crowd was silent, staring at this man they'd ignored for years, now standing like a lighthouse in the storm's aftermath. That night, the Harbor Light Diner was packed. Everyone was talking about Jack. Hank, Tommy's father, stood up, holding an old cigar box. "Found this in Jack's shack years ago," he said, his voice thick. Inside was a faded photo, a medal and a patch. The photo showed a younger Jack, standing with a Coast Guard rescue team, his wetsuit gleaming under the sun. The patch bore the insignia of an elite maritime rescue unit. The medal? For saving 15 men during a nor'easter in '89. Hank looked around the room. "Jack saved this town once before, but he never told us. We never asked." Tommy, his eyes red, turned to Jack. "Why didn't you say anything?" Jack gave a half smile, the kind that carried decades of weight. "Some men talk, others do. I picked the second one." The diner fell quiet. Jack stood, tipped his head to the crowd, and walked back to his shack. But Harbor Cove was different now. Kids waved when they saw him. Fishermen nodded with respect. Tommy repainted his boat to match Jack's skiff, saying, "That little boat beat the ocean. It's the king of the sea." Jack didn't need a medal to be a hero. His story was written in the waves, in the choices he made when no one was watching. So we ask you, have you ever met a Jack? Someone who seemed ordinary but carried a legacy that changed everything? Share their story in the comments. Say their name, because some heroes live quietly but should never be forgotten. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, share it, and join silent heroes in keeping these stories alive. We'll see you in the next one, and until then, remember, sometimes the greatest heroes sail in the smallest boats.